evening we will explore the topic of the future of interreligious dialogue through the lens of the four of the essayists of the new book published by Orbis called The Future of Interreligious Dialogue, a multi-religious conversation on Nostra Aetate. Nostra Aetate is a 53-year-old document that comes from the Second Vatican Council. It's a document that I think we could all agree is a very dated document, an imperfect document to be sure. Nevertheless, it's a document that has been a tremendous stimulus for reconsideration of the relation not only of the Catholic Church to religions of the world, but also of other religious traditions looking at and with one another, the learning in the presence of the other. I'm Mary Boyes, I'm the academic dean here at Union, and I'm happy to be the moderator of this panel. We had 5 panelists. Unfortunately, Professor Jeannine Fletcher of Fordham University is unable to get here due to complications from the weather. And in fact, not only can't get here, but also could not get home to New Jersey, since there are no buses after 4:30 p.m. today. So we will go with the people who are here, and let me introduce the panelists. And each of the panelists whom we have here tonight has contributed one of the chapters to this very impressive book, and there will be copies available for your purchase after this presentation. So let me just give you, if I might, a little overview of this panel. We will start to my far right. I always wanted to say that Paul Nitter was to my far right. Paul is the Emeritus Paul Tillich Professor of Theology, World Religions and Culture here at Union Theological Seminary, and before that he was an Emeritus Professor of Theology at Xavier University. And Xavier has an advantage over Union in that they are playing a basketball tournament, and I do believe that that's the reason that Kathy and Paul have come, is to go to the basketball game tomorrow night. But at any rate, so I'm going to give an overview first, and then we'll let each panelist go seriatim. Paul has something very distinctive to contribute, not only because of his impressive scholarship over the years, but if I might say this, Paul, you were a seminarian in Rome in 1965. In fact, before that, when did you go to Rome? 1962. So that was the opening of the Second Vatican Council. And in those days, I won't call them the good old days, Catholic seminarians spoke Latin, and their courses were in Latin. And the language of the council was Latin, but most of the bishops had long since forgotten their Latin. And so some of the very accomplished seminarians often saw the documents of Vatican II, of which there are many, this being a compilation of these documents. And I believe that you saw Nostra Aetate before it was actually an official document of the council. So we will give Paul a little more time first to give a little backdrop, a little personal experience of his own life in Rome, knowing the people who were at Vatican II. And then he will then begin, after giving a little background. Each of the panelists has agreed to spend 5 minutes on his or her chapter in the book, giving essentially a kind of an elevator speech of what was in the chapter. And then another 2 minutes or so, and the or so does not extend beyond about 3, to another chapter in this very fine collection. This is really a stunning collection. It's one of the very best books written on the document Nostra Aetate. So we'll go then in the order of the chapters. So we'll begin then with Paul Tillich, who also Paul Tillich is nothing compared to Paul Nitter, let me assure you. And Paul also is, besides having a chapter, is also one of the 3 editors of the volume. And then we'll go to Professor Roger Haight, scholar in residence at Union Theological Seminary, former professor of systematic theology at the Jesuit schools in Manila, the Philippines, in Chicago, and in Toronto, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and most happily back here at Union. His chapter is called The Christian Spiritual Vision for the Perspective of Nostra Aetate. Third in our Trinity, third is our colleague, Professor Jerusha Lamptey, who is Assistant Professor of Islam and Interreligious Engagement. She's also the Director of the Program in Islam, Social Justice, and Interreligious Engagement, or ISG. Her chapter is called Beyond the Rays of Truth, Nostra Aetate, Islam, and the Value of Difference. Finally, we will go to Professor John Thatamanil, Associate Professor of Theology, World Religions, and Culture at Union, whose chapter is entitled Learning from and Not Just About Our Religious Neighbors, Comparative Theology and the Future of Nostra Aetate. So we'll begin then with about 10 minutes of sort of a very personal backdrop or background on Vatican II, and then to Paul's own chapter called Nostra Aetate, a milestone in the history of religions, from competition to cooperation. So Paul, please lead us on.
Okay. Thank you, Mary. And thank you, Mary, John, all of you who made this event possible and really made it possible for Kathy and I to return to Union, return to home. I mean, just coming back here, this reminds us, I speak for Kathy as well, of how much Union was home to us for those 7 years, almost 7 years that we were here. A very precious time. It's good to be back and see a lot of familiar faces. Well, I want to give a little background, as Mary said, but first just some immediate background. The book came out of a conference that was organized at the University of Wisconsin in Madison to be part of the celebration for the 50th anniversary of the issuing of Nostra Aetate, which was in October 28, 1965. And that conference, and I think the book that resulted from it, was distinctive, I think, is distinctive in two ways. There were a lot of conferences and gatherings to celebrate the anniversary of Nostra Aetate. All of them were at Catholic universities here in the United States. Our conference took place at a public university. And any of you who are acquainted with the Roman Catholic Church and its concerns for orthodoxy, that meant that we were a lot freer than many of the other conferences at Catholic universities. But the conference was also distinctive in another way, in that it was multi and interreligious. You know, if Nostra Aetate had a lot to say about other religions, we wanted to hear what other religions had to say about Nostra Aetate. And I think that gives that conference and this book a very distinctive character. But to frame Nostra Aetate in its historical reality, and here I'm going to be, as Mary suggested and invited me to be, a bit personal. I think that the meaning of Nostra Aetate, if I may be so bold, the meaning that this document had for the Catholic Church and for other Christian churches, I think is reflected in miniature in the historic meaning it had in my own personal life. Back in '62, as Mary mentioned, I was, at that time, what is called a major seminarian. Kind of a very impressive title. A major seminarian. That meant I was studying to be a missionary priest in the Society of the Divine Word. And I was beginning the 10th year of a 14-year program in preparation for ordination. The last 4 years are theological studies. So I had begun my seminary training when I entered a minor seminary in 1952 to begin this preparation. And at that time, like so many Christians, I was bear with me, I'm older than most of you, I was convinced that Christ and Christianity were the only ways to really find God and to find salvation. And that meant if I wanted to really love my neighbors in other religions, the best thing I could do for them was to convert them. I mean, that was an act of love. Because otherwise, they were in trouble. And I remember, some of you have heard this before, I remember this, I still remember by heart, the prayer that we said in the seminary 4 times a day. May the darkness of sin and the night of heathenism vanish before the light of the Word and the Spirit of grace. We prayed that 4 times a day. But by 1962, as I began these last 4 years of my training, I was unsettled by all kinds of questions about these other religions. Why? Because over the years I had started to study them, especially Hinduism and Buddhism. And what I found didn't look like darkness and night of heathenism and sin. And then I was doing some reading about the damage that Christian missionaries had done to other cultures. So I was really kind of struggling. What does it mean to be a missionary? Or more fun, to be a Christian? And it was while I was struggling with these questions that one of the greatest gifts of my life landed in my lap. Not the greatest. The greatest was when I met Kathy, but my future wife. But one of the greatest gifts that I had received when I was asked if I would go to Rome, if I would be willing to go to Rome for my last 4 years of theological studies. That was a no-brainer. At that time, I don't know, some of you might, Catholic seminaries were very similar to prisons. We rarely were permitted to go beyond the walls of the seminary. But the Gregorian University, where I would be studying, was located in the heart of Rome, just down the street from the Forum and the Colosseum. And we'd be going into the city among real people every day. And half those real people were women. So it was an invitation. So I arrived in Rome at the end of September 1962. 2 weeks later came another unexpected gift. I was standing in Piazza San Pietro on October 11th, and it was about from here to the mirror from Pope John the 23rd as he led 2,500 bishops into the Basilica of St. Peter's for the opening day of the Second Vatican Council. And I had a little box camera, and I took a black and white picture of Pope John as he was carried on his sedis gestatoria, you know, the portable throne. And I sent it to my mother, and after she died, they found this picture in her papers. And here it is. If any of you want to come up afterwards and take a look at it, it's I guess it's kind of a relic or an antique. Anyway, this was just an extraordinary experience. But then, as Mary said, I got an even closer view of the council and what was going on, because we had 24 missionary bishops from all over the world: New Guinea, India, Indonesia, Togo, Africa, Ghana. Nigeria. They were there for the council. So every morning they would get on the bus to go to St. Peter's, and we would start our walk to the Gregorian University around the same time, 8:30. And then in the evening, we'd come back and hobnob with them and what went on. And as Mary said, a number of them, mainly the American bishops, couldn't read Latin anymore if they ever could. And so all of our classes, as Mary said, were in Latin, and so they asked us to translate for them, to help them do their homework. And that was a major part of my theological education in Rome. Just being there for all 4 sessions, from 1962 when I arrived to 1965 when the last session took place. And as Mary said, I've told some of you, I can still picture in my mind the place I was standing in the Collegio del Verbo Divino, where we were living with the bishops, right in front of the chapel doors, when Bishop Bishop Simon of Sambalpur, India, showed me one of the early drafts of Nostra Aetate. And I just could not believe what I read there. I had never dreamed that my church, not known for its theological openness and innovation, could officially say such positive things about other religions as you find in Nostra Aetate. And just to quote, that there are things true and holy, sacrum, good things spiritual and ethical, that you find in the religion seeds of God's word that are dispersed to all. And then the kicker. Catholics, all Christians, are called to engage in colloquia and collaboratio, dialogue and collaboration with people of other religions. That has never before been said by an official document of any church, I think in the history of Christianity. And I still have my yellowed pages, document of Nostra Aetate, that one of the first editions of it, very first, that came off from the Typis Polyglottis Vaticanus, the Vatican publishing office, 1965, Declaratio de Ecclesia Habitudine ad Religiones non Christianas. And it has become for me, in this sense, a real relic. It was a liberation. And I think you have to be as old as I to understand what I mean when I say it was a liberation. As I said, we were brought up in a church in which, and I think this is true of most of the Christian churches at that time, in what we call today an exclusivist theology. Extra ecclesiam nolo salus. Outside the church, there's no salvation. And you know what church they meant when they said ecclesia, the Roman Catholic. And here was now my church affirming that God is to be found in other religions. And when they said there things holy, that meant that God implied that God was saving people in their religions. Before, the Catholic Church had said it's possible to be saved outside of the church through baptism of desire and all those theological inventions that the people created. But they never said that the religions could be positive means in helping people find the meaning of their life, a satisfying meaning which we call salvation. So just reading that, I was theologically kind of a new man in Paul's terms, a new creation. But Nostra Aetate, it was a liberation, but it was only a partial liberation. Really, you have to understand that for me at that time, it just freed me up in incredible ways. But when I returned after I'd finishing my doctoral work in Germany to the States, to Chicago, Catholic Theological Union in 1972, I started to more seriously study other religions by teaching them and to engage in dialogue with especially Buddhists and Hindus, the Vedanta Society there on the south side of Chicago in Hyde Park. And my friends in other religions enabled me to recognize the implications of what Nostra Aetate and other Vatican documents went on to say about the religions. Well, not so much about the religion, but about themselves, about the Catholic Church in relation to other religions. Namely, just to summarize it, and all these wonderful things in the religions, the truth and the goodness, the spiritual values, the moral values, they were all there as a preparatio evangelica, a preparation for the gospel. God was present in other religions, in other words, to prepare them to be Catholics, to be Christians. And why? Why? Because Christians believe that in Jesus Christ, they have the one and only Savior of all humanity, and the final fullness of God's revelation and truth. Now, this is not only offensive, as I found out, to people of other religions, but it's a contradiction to Nostra Aetate and to much of Christian theology. So what I mean by this is the contradiction. On the one hand, Nostra Aetate calls Christians to enter into authentic dialogue with persons of other traditions. And you hear this again and again from the World Council of Churches down. Dialogue. But dialogue means speaking with each other, exploring together, learning from each other. I ask you, how is that possible when one side insists that God, or ultimate reality, has granted them, and only them, the final truth? When one side believes that God, as it were, has given them all the aces in this game of dialogue. There is, and that's what I argue in my chapter, getting into this now, a contradiction in Christian teaching between the praxis of dialogue, to which all Christians feel themselves called, and the theory, I would say the Christology, that insists on Jesus as the one and only Savior. To put it harshly, Christians enter the dialogue with at least implicit, not explicit, but implicit claims of Christian superiority, Christian supremacy. And such claims render dialogue impossible, it seems to me. If you could prove that I'm wrong on that, I would be very happy. But I don't see. So what I would hesitate to say at a Catholic conference on Nostra Aetate, but what I did say at the University of Wisconsin, and what I feel free to say here at Union, is that it seems to me, and I want to say this carefully, it seems to me that Christians will not be able to move beyond Christian supremacy unless they move beyond their insistence on the supremacy of Jesus. And I do believe that it is possible, and I've dedicated much of my theological career, and other people on this panel have done as well. I do believe that we can develop a pluralistic dialogical Christology that can affirm the universal saving role of Jesus without affirming an absolute or exclusive role for Jesus. Or that Christians can be as personally committed to Jesus. That's what a Christian is. A commitment to the gospel and to gospel values as taught and represented and embodied in the living Christ. But at the same time, they can be, just as deeply as they're committed to Jesus, they can be just as authentically open to other religions. That's what we're working on, trying to work out a Christology that can bear that weight. And I can do that much more easily as a lay Catholic theologian than Catholic theologians who are priests or nuns who are also exploring in this direction, all of whom who have done this or moved in this direction have gotten into some kind of trouble with the Vatican. I think some people on this panel can speak to that more personally. And this is why I would carefully, but clearly suggest that Nostra Aetate can be seen as preparing the way for what I think, okay, let me do some jargon, but seriously, what I think we can call a new axial shift in the history of religions. As many of you know, many historians argue that there was an actual shift in the religious consciousness of humanity between about 900 and 200 BCE. I would like to endorse the claim or hope that Robert Bellah voiced in the final pages of his last work, Religion in Human Evolution, from the Paleolithic to the Axial Age. He recognized that since the first axial age, 900 to 200 BCE, most religions have made claims of supremacy, and I quote Bellah, thought that it was they and they alone who had found the final truth. So in other words, the problem of supremacy is not just a Christian problem. I mean, I think most religions, maybe with the exception of indigenous traditions, and maybe with the exception of Judaism, Mary, you can speak to that better than I, have made claims of having the final word, or the best path to enlightenment, or the ultimate truth, or the last prophet. No more prophets after this last prophet. I think we all move in this direction. But Bellah also asserts, and this is what I want to stress, that we have begun, and I quote Robert Bellah here in his last book, begun to see the emergence of a new point of view, one that could understand and appreciate all religions on their own terms, and a view that was not driven to set up one of them as the apex for all the others, close quote. And he goes on to note that there is an increasing, this is a quotation, an increasing number of serious students of religion, and I would add of serious practitioners of religion, who can accept religious pluralism as our destiny without making a claim to the superiority of any one tradition. Now he did that as a scholar of his history of sociology of religion. Nostra Aetate did not arrive at that point, namely to accept religious pluralism as our destiny without claims of superiority. But in the terminology of my good friend of blessed memory, John Haight, Nostra Aetate built a bridge that can lead to such an axial shift in religious awareness. And I think it is time for us now to cross that bridge. Finally, as Mary instructed us, 2 minutes. I'm going to be right on time. By now I know why she's dean. Teasing Mary. We were asked to comment on what particular other essay in the volume was a gift, a special gift. And I chose the essay, a little bit biased here, of my dear friend, Rita Gross. A gift that she gave me and to all of us, I think. She was, when we invited her to this conference, Rita was quite sick, but she said she wanted to come, and she did. And some months later, not because she came to the council, but she passed away. So that's her essay here was her last academic contribution. But in that contribution in our book, and in her own last book, she formulated her main point as a simple, sobering question. This is the title of her book, more or less. Religious diversity? What's the problem? What's the problem? For Rita, religious diversity was not a problem. Religious supremacy was. And so I'd like to close by just reading a passage from Rita that I quoted in my essay, where Rita writes, here it is. The result of exclusivist, supremacist truth claims is not religious agreement. She's writing as a Buddhist. It is suffering. The track record of religions that claim exclusive and universal truth for themselves is not praiseworthy or uplifting. How much empire building, how many crusades and religious wars, big and small, have gone on in the name of defending the one true faith. There seems to be a cause and effect link between the claim of exclusive truth and suffering. Or to say it more strongly, the main result of exclusive truth claims has been suffering, not salvation. Rita's admonition and Nostra Aetate's invitation still stand, I believe, as a challenge for all religious believers and leaders. Thank you.
I would note also that you dedicated the volume to Rita Gross, to her as a scholar, advocate, and friend for a lifetime. And I guess I would just observe that interreligious exchange is not just about intellectual ideas, it's very much about relationships. Maybe that's the most important aspect. So we turn now to Professor Roger Haight.
So I approach Nostra Aetate and interreligious dialogue as a Christian systematic theologian who thinks that the Christian message is true and corresponds with reality, and therefore it should be universally relevant. In the past, that has meant that if Christianity is true, then other religions must not be so. But in my view, faith traditions are not in competition with each other. So I agree with everything that Paul said and everything that he intimated about the Christian message and about its self-understanding. The religions exist in a religiously pluralistic field, and I take that to be a simple given. Here we are. Therefore, we have to understand Christianity in a way that valorizes other religions, all religions in principle. Such is Christianity's truth, if it's to be universally relevant. But how can one do that if, as Paul said, within Christian traditions, the message of Jesus Christ has relativized all the other religions, and the Christianity has assumed this kind of position of superiority, and that's written deeply into the Christian traditions of just about all the churches. So there's the problem that I was dealing with in my paper. How does one sort of correct that situation for one's church, so that one's church, you can bring it along? One way is to set up a dialogue between an official conciliar document, which bears authority, such as Nostra Aetate, and draw forward from it some of its central affirmations in such a way that they address with authority the present situation. So this is hermeneutical theology. It's an essay and an exercise of interpretation, bringing past meanings that bear authority without distorting their message, but opening it up to a new situation in such a way that it continues to bear authority because it continues to bear relevance to a new world and a new consciousness. So here in a condensed form is the result of the interpretation that you find in this essay. Nostra Aetate contains in embryonic form elements that can be expanded into an elementary Christian spiritual vision of the interrelationship between the world's faiths and can accommodate them, that is to say, valorize them, see them as non-competitive but autonomously valid faiths. These elements are the ones that I choose to work with. A belief in a single creator God of love, an understanding of God through the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, that's the Christian dimension, and belief in a natural order that is grace-filled or imbued with God as Spirit, making all human beings brothers and sisters to each other, and making authentic revelation a universal possibility. I find those three things in Nostra Aetate implied, not spoken, they couldn't have been spoken then, but implied, and because they're there, because we live in a different situation, the words of the past explode with new meaning given our new situation. This These three elements together generate gratitude for other religions and encourage them as contributions to a larger experience, the experience of creation itself, and of our ultimate ground of being. So what Christians call Creator God doesn't mean that other religions will call ultimate reality Creator God. They'll call it by the name that is revealed to their tradition. All of this can be elicited by commentary on a 50-year-old text by asking what it carries within itself implicitly and how it addresses what it does, its words, how they address the religious sensibility of our common situation today. So it requires a kind of sympathetic reading of our situation today, namely an interreligious reality, and which we are necessarily because of our historical constitution. Behind my essay, and somewhat discernible in it, is a conviction from a Christian perspective that the doctrine of creation can play a major role in this reconstruction and open Christian self-understanding in a way that has been too narrowly constrained by the doctrine of redemption. The doctrine of creation is simply undervalued. And so too are the extraordinary insights drawn from a Christian dialogue with science and evolution. These areas of investigation will surely have a structural impact on the imagination of all faith traditions given time. So that's kind of what I lay out in 15, 16 pages. Finally, I want to just comment on another essay that I found interesting and expansive, that of Jerusha Lamptey. I was particularly engaged by the distinction between what faith traditions share in common and what they have distinctively as their own in particular. So the tension between a common experience of being in relationship to a higher reality, which will take, of course, different modalities and so on, but something that can be shared in common, but things that are not shared across denominations, that is to say, across faith traditions. I think that this tension really bears more conversation. It's a kind of conversation that opens up the imagination, and it can really be a helpful way of not only finding analogies in one's own faith tradition with others, but allowing others precisely to be other and still be autonomous, because we're not in competition with each other. Thank you.
Now to the contribution of Professor Jerusha Lamptey. I should just say that in the document Nostra Aetate, which is the shortest of the documents from Vatican II, and the most highly contested during the 4 sessions of the Council, that there is explicit mention of the Church's relations with Hinduism, with Islam, and with Judaism. In the first 2 cases, those are very brief mentions. The discussion of the relationship with Judaism is somewhat longer, partly because that's been the Church's most problematic relation for nearly 2,000 years. So I'm very happy that my colleague, Professor Lamptey, and actually very ably introduced by Professor Haight, now we can turn to her essay on Beyond the Ways of Truth, question mark, Nostra Aetate, Islam, and the Value of Difference.
So I'm also timing myself. So yes, I've received, okay. Okay, so I'm pausing. You just give me the heads up. So that is a wonderful introduction. I appreciate the comments and it points directly to what I wrote about in this essay. But before I talk about some of the general ideas and trajectories in this chapter, I want to say that I am fully aware of my positionality, especially on this panel, and coming to this as one member or a member of a group that is talked about in Nostra Aetate. And so when Dr. Knitter says we wanted to hear what people who were talked about had to say, of course there's lots of different classifications, including Protestants, but I come to this with that positionality. I should also say that I come to this discussion with another positionality, which those of you who are my students will know, and that's that I am an absolute lover of Vatican Council II and studied under John O'Malley, just enthralled beyond belief. And when I try to account for my enduring love of the decrees and documents, I think the only thing that I can really put my finger on is that it is such a profound moment of seismic change. And for those of us who are interested in articulating and paving paths towards change, to watch change actually happen in such large ways over 4 years is quite earth-shattering. And of course, coming from a tradition that doesn't have that kind of authority structure in place, of course, that's something interesting to think about. So beyond all that, I'm just going to say a few things about what I wrote about in this chapter. As Father Haight so aptly introduced, my preoccupation in my contribution is there any value to religious difference in Nostra Aetate? So in specific, I wanted to focus on what is said about Islam, and I wanted to trace some of the forward-looking trajectories out of Nostra Aetate. So not just look at the document, but also look at what happened afterwards. So what did Pope John Paul have to say? Now, a lot of what he had to say was exactly what Nostra Aetate said, but he also had other engagements. And then I also look at some of the statements made by Pope Francis, which are more contemporary statements. But the central question is there any room for valuing the distinctive aspects of tradition? And so that discloses a main observation that I make about Nostra Aetate, and that is to claim that Nostra Aetate, when it comes at least to Islam and other traditions, not Judaism, as Dr. Boyce has already mentioned, but with Islam and other traditions, that there is a overarching valuing of that which is familiar with Catholicism and that which is shared with Catholicism. So when Islam is not technically valued in Nostra Aetate. The practices and faith of Muslim people are valued. And I think that's an important distinction, right? So to Dr. Knitter's point that this is valuing religions in themselves, we can have a discussion there because in fact, it's valuing the rites and rituals and practices of religiosity of people. And that's slightly different than valuing the theological tenets or infrastructure of a tradition. But intriguingly, and I think to the point of where there's any valuation of difference, those areas are definitively areas where Islam overlaps with Catholicism. So in the presentation of God on certain attributes, in the performance of certain rituals and certain ethical guidelines, and even in the valuation of Muslims' ability to pray publicly. It's almost Pope John Paul will take this and make it explicit, but there is some deployment of praise of Muslim religiosity to castigate Christian lack of religiosity going on in Nostra Aetate. And so whether Muslims can be praised even as rays of truth on their own distinctive merits, to me is an outstanding question in Nostra Aetate. I think it's ground shifting, I think it's incredibly important, but I don't think it ventures into the terrain of religious distinctiveness. Now let me just say two quick things about what happens afterwards and happens coming into the moment now. Pope John Paul kind of continues to verbatim say what Nostra Aetate says, but then especially in his own memoirs, starts to get into some of the distinctiveness and grapple with things like the real presentation of divine ontology, So divine ontology is actually different. Yes, there's a creator God that's shared, but when you get down just below the surface slightly, you start to see significant differences. And he tries to grapple with what those may mean. He ends up describing Islamic divine ontology as reductive. And he ends up talking about how this leads to a whole different theological anthropology. Oh, we were talking about this in class today. A totally different understanding of who the human is. But he doesn't quite know what to do with that. Right? He wants to affirm the sameness and affirm the value, but he also sees these profound distinctiveness, but he doesn't know where to take it. The final thing I'll say about what you see in some of the statements and speeches of Pope Francis is you start to see emerging a whole new take on the power and value of religious distinctiveness. He, like Pope John Paul, acknowledges the differences, but when he talks about what the power and value and purpose of those differences is, he starts to see them on their own terms. They're not just areas of argumentation. They start to sound a lot like necessities. So he refers to, in the practice of dialogue and cooperation, the necessities of difference. That the differences of other traditions and other religious people, that they help us learn things. And so he goes, especially, there was a speech given at the anniversary of the Institute for Islamic and Arabic Sciences, which is part of the Pontifical Institute. And in that speech, he went on and on and on about the need for pedagogical and deep learning about other differences and how you have to, let me find the quote because it's I think I highlighted it, but a profound quote about how you have to approach the other without kicking up the dust of your own self-identity. I mean, it's just a beautiful image. And so he's moving into this discussion of the power of difference on its own terms and what it can do for self-understanding, but also reconstructing and reconfiguring what we think dialogue is and where it's supposed to go. And so I'm going to stop with that, except, should I say 2 minutes? Okay. So just briefly, I will say that the contribution I was going to raise up from another chapter was Dr. Jeannine Fletcher's contribution. I think she raises very interesting questions about what was going on in this country in the civil rights era and around race and around whiteness in theology, but also in civil rights movements, and how that intersects with what was going on in Vatican Council II, but also how it was received here. Important observations about white theology and whiteness in communities and how that might have limited some of the reception. Let me just put it that way. But read that chapter. Thank you so much.
Just to build on your final comments, Jerusha, I would note that some of the chapter that Jeannine Fletcher wrote is taken from her book that should have appeared in the fall.
It's out.
It's out, okay. From Orbis Press, called The Sin of White Supremacy. So, from Orbis Books, Jeannine Fletcher. So, Professor Thatamanil, you are batting cleanup.
Quite a daunting responsibility.
Bases loaded.
In this position, I always feel tempted to say something like the inverse of John the Baptist, you know. I'm not the one who comes after, whose souls cannot be touched, but I am in the other position. So, last and least. My contribution is entitled, in this book, Learning from and Not Just About Religious Neighbors. Comparative Theology and the Future of Nostra Aetate, which is also, I think, the future of interreligious dialogue. The title itself gives you a good sense of what I take to be required for the future of interreligious dialogue. Again, not just for the Catholic Church, but for our traditions, all of them in general. Just a quick note in terms of terminology. When academics talk about the work of learning about other religious traditions, or saying something about them and their status, are they salvific, etc., We typically call that work the theology of religious diversity, theology of religious pluralism. I prefer to call it theology of religious diversity. And as I said, that field is dedicated to saying something about the status of other religious traditions as seen from our own. Now that field does more, but that's one quick way of talking about theology of religious diversity. But what I am most interested in is not so much theology of religious diversity alone, but comparative theology, which is what I mean when I say learning from other traditions. Nostra Aetate is typically read as largely dedicated to the first task and not given to the second task. I argue that that is largely but not wholly true. There are, and this is I think momentous and historic, claims in an official church document about other religious traditions in particular. So that is to say, you see that that's significant? It's an official proclamation of one tradition now engaging specific features of others, even if quickly and hastily. Nonetheless, I think it's momentous. Although we tend to read Nostra Aetate as about theology of religious diversity, I think it makes a start, a fitful start towards comparative theology. But in my chapter, I argue that Nostra Aetate is limited in how far it can go, and this overlaps really rather nicely with what Dr. Lamptey just said. It's limited because the whole of the document, I argue, is captured by what I call an attitude, an atmosphere of religious self-sufficiency. The Catholic Church possesses all it needs to know about religious truth in full, and hence Christians stand in no positive need of their religious neighbors to move more deeply into the divine life. That attitude is what I mean by religious self-sufficiency. In terms of the technical jargon of the field, I think it is right to say that the document moves us from exclusivism to inclusivism, from true-false to some hierarchical notion of others have partial truth. They are a ray of that light that illumines all persons. So you're a ray if you're a member of another religious tradition, but we've got the whole thing. That's what is typically called hierarchical inclusivism. But I argue also that there is implicitly a kind of graded inclusivism at work in the sequence of traditions discussed. Not all traditions, in other words, stand on equal footing. They are graded. There's an implicit rank ordering. There's a bare passing mention, and you have to infer it, of primal or indigenous traditions. So they kind of are acknowledged. But most of the traditions spoken of are so-called the religions of the advanced cultures. So there's a, see what I mean by graded? Even cultures are graded. And then there's a sequence, and the sequence of treatment is not, I don't think, arbitrary. Hinduism is mentioned first, Buddhism second, Islam third, Judaism next. So you see that? There's a kind of concentric circle model of the various religious traditions. So the specificity is there, but it's a graded specificity. Now, while the language of the document with respect to other religious traditions is, I think, positive and admirable, there is a limit. Here's some of the language of the document itself. The church therefore exerts her sons, I'm going to read it as it's originally there. The church therefore, though it's not original because I'm not citing in Latin. I'll leave that to Paul.
Inclusive language.
Oh, you do have an inclusive language.
Well, it only took 50 years, but you know.
Yeah. So would you want to read that paragraph about the exhortation? Oh, lovely. We are truly a collaborative path. I didn't even know that there was an inclusivity.
Well, you know, we don't move too quickly. There were more Protestant observers.
Is it an official inclusive?
Well,
Vatican approved?
what do they know about inclusive? Here we go.
in number 2.
What is that particular paragraph?
We're calling for dialogue.
Exhorts her sons and daughters through dialogue and
Yeah, that's
collaboration.
number 2. Here, at the last paragraph of number 2.
Do we have
Ah.
the first one there?
Oh, yes, here it is. Yes, the church therefore urges its sons and daughters. Okay, that's better, but we're still in the binary.
Oh, come on. It took us 2,000 years to do this.
I know. We're all learning on this front. The church therefore urges its sons and daughters to enter with prudence and charity into discussion and collaboration with members of other religions. Let Christians, while witnessing to their own faith and way of life, and I want you to listen to these verbs, because the verbs are really exciting and interesting. Acknowledge, preserve, and encourage the spiritual and moral truths found among non-Christians, together with their social life and culture. Acknowledge, preserve, and encourage. In another translation I have, the word is promote. That is
The Latin promote.
the Latin is promote. Yeah. So those are encouraging words with respect to the attitudes, the deeds that Christian communities are called to. And if there are things there to be recognized, preserved, and acknowledged, or preserved, or promoted, then there's something positive there. I am pleased with these verbs, but I imagine that a truly remarkable turn would happen in interrupting the atmosphere of religious self-sufficiency if we added one more: receive. What would it look like if we added that verb? So if I propose that somebody gets us all together to rewrite Nostra Aetate, a future Nostra Aetate should include that word. With that shift, we move from the past of Nostra Aetate to the future of Nostra Aetate. And no one has accused me of being particularly humble. Many other accusations have been made, but not that one. So I said, hey, what the heck? I'll give it a shot. I'll write a future Nostra Aetate, at least a couple of paragraphs. So here, a Protestant, quasi-Hindu, quasi-Buddhist theologian has taken upon himself the task of writing the future of Nostra Aetate. And here, I just want to read you just a couple of snippets of what this would look like, what Nostra Aetate would sound like if we put in the word receive. The Catholic Church reaffirms that it rejects nothing that is true and holy in other religions. The Church wishes also to affirm that love of the one who is the truth compels it to receive truth and wisdom from those outside the Church. For the Word is also the light that illumines all people. That saving light has never and can never be extinguished from the lives and the teachings of other traditions. I hope that gives you a feel of what I hope a future. The question is, do these traditions have an ongoing place in the divine economy? Or are they just preparations for the church? By phrasing it this way, I'm trying to argue these traditions continue to matter for us. Then another little snippet. The church also confesses in humility that it does not know all there is to know about the Word who has become flesh. We acknowledge that the church can learn more about the Christ from those who have learned to love, follow, and serve Him, but without entering into the full and explicit fellowship in the church. In the maturity and mutuality of fellowship with all those who seek to know God more fully, the church stands prepared not only to teach, but also to learn, not only to challenge, but also to be challenged. If that kind of discourse is acknowledged, and we begin to speak about acknowledge, preserve, promote, and receive the wisdom of other traditions, including First Nations, I should add, then I think we would have a Nostra Aetate that would be compelling for our age and establish the groundwork for the future of interreligious dialogue. So that's all I want to say about my chapter. 1 minute, okay. The chapter I want to commend to your attention is a lovely, brief, elegant piece by Jeffrey Long, who puts Swami Vivekananda in conversation with Nostra Aetate. He points out that Vivekananda could also be read as a kind of inclusivist, because he does have moments where he says that the Vedas are the highest disclosure of truth present in any of the traditions. But then there's a twist. What he means by Vedas is something more like, and he draws this comparison, what Christians mean when they speak about the Logos, or the Word. The Vedas are not the book. The Vedas are the eternal, apurusheya, is the Sanskrit term, authorless wisdom embedded in the fabric of the universe itself. So if so read, his inclusivism can be moved into a kind of pluralism. He notes that the same possibility are offered in Christian traditions for a kind of inclusivism that can be moved into a pluralism. He just wonders, though, whether Christians are really meaning it, and he doesn't think that Nostra Aetate does. So he worries that Nostra Aetate prepares the ground for not conversation, but conversion. And that he finds, of course, problematic. So I commend that wonderful engagement with Swami Vivekananda and Nostra Aetate by Jeffrey Long. Thank you.
We have roughly 20 minutes or so for some questions to the panel, but before we do that, so that everybody has a chance to have a say, I would like to invite you to turn to a neighbor, preferably someone you don't know so well, but whatever, and just maybe some one thing that's kind of percolating in you after these 4 panelists. There are no right answers or wrong, it's just a chance for everyone to get a voice.
You are here in the... you're in after a very long time. Where are you going from? I'm from Ohio. What is the study of the building? I'm looking really interested in the relationship of the white church.
Oh, a lot of things. I just like what Dr. Thatamanil making an effort to rewrite.
I'm a writer.
Yeah.
How about you? I am a Catholic priest. I am working here.
Might have a capacity to take a text different or adjust it to
I came here to help
different realities. You should make it. Please try. Not be afraid. Even if it's only for
the whole semester. Summer. So just arrived to prove my English, to know what he is, because I am also chaplain in the University of Chile. On the fourth university, have a lot of contact with them. Change professors, and I was here 2 years ago. Invited from the university, and I lived with him in the parish. He invited me to stay longer. philosopher came back. Yeah, for me, it's the first month. What's that? It's so near. Fantastic. Interesting also. Wonderful. Well, New York is a wonderful city. Mexico. The university also. My English is not so good, but I visited two classes, so you say, lectures there. One of about history of the second of religion and movies. But that's professor. It's very good. With the masses, I stay there in the house, I take part in a group, they have students who go there,
I hope everybody's had a chance to speak. To be heard.
Welcome. Thank you very much.
So at this point, the panel is willing to take questions. In order that we can have as much involvement as possible in the limited time, because we're going to end by 8:30 or so, we decided, this half of the panel decided we didn't turn to the people on our left. That we'll take maybe 2 questions at a time, and please ask a real question. And also, if you can, try to ask it as briefly as possible, so that we can maximize our time together. So, I'd like to privilege people who are not in union as students, since you have a chance to ask professors things all the time. So, here and yes, Carolyn next. So, yes. Now, if you would stand so everybody could hear, and also so that the camera can get you.
Okay, sure.
This is your chance for Hollywood.
I'll try to make this sensible. So, what about those who profess no particular religion, agnostics, atheists? I mean, do they have room in this conversation? How might they fit in?
Okay. Carolyn?
Well, now I'm afraid to ask my question, but so it's a real question. I think it's a naive question about how live this document remains. I feel that you've revived it, and there's going to be a lot in that for us now. But how much is Nostra Aetate 50 years on really moving things forward?
All right. So, what about those who do not profess faith in God?
Well, I prefer the second question.
Oh. Why don't you start with the second one, and we can go back to the first.
Yeah, how live, so you can hear it, how live Nostra Aetate remains. I guess I'm kind of biased, but I think if not explicitly, implicitly, if not directly, indirectly, it's very much alive. Mainly because it really did open up and continues to open up and to foster a readiness and even, dare I say, eagerness on the part of Christians to engage people of other religions for the purpose of discussions, colloquia, discussions and collaboration. And that was promoted, I'm really happy and proud to say, by Pope Paul VI during the council when he established what at that time was called the Secretariat for Non-Christian Religions, now called the Commission for Interreligious Dialogue of the Vatican, whose intent was to promote dialogue. And I think this is what has kind of the getaway horse in the Catholic Church, insofar as, yes, Catholics, as is often the case, are very obedient, and when you tell them to dialogue, they're going to dialogue. And they have. And the experiences that have been gained, the questions that have mounted through this real contact with others are, in a very happy way, profoundly disturbing to some traditional doctrinal perspectives. So I think it's the horse is out of the barn and you ain't going to get them back.
On the question of people who are outside of any given religious tradition, speaking for the Second Vatican Council, they did address that, and they said that all people have an opportunity for salvation because grace is readily available to all people, but they didn't really develop a theology and explain it. But in more than one text, you can see that the Council taught that the doctrine of no salvation outside the church is dead for Catholics.
Can I just add something to that quickly? And really, what we're talking, the topic we're talking about is interreligious dialogue, how to get followers of the various traditions to engage each other. And so that's kind of the specific topic, and therefore we didn't. However, as what is being recognized now more and more is what kind of a dialogue would it be, or would it have to be, that would engage not only people with a religious commitment, but people without any such commitment. And that's been more, the trend of that kind of dialogue, promoted especially by Pope Francis, is a dialogue that deals with human and environmental well-being. On that topic, these practical how to promote human and environmental flourishing. On that, what do religions have to say about that topic, and what do so-called secular humanists? We can talk to each other about those issues.
Can I just say one thing brief there? Just say that that's not the topic for tonight in Nostra Aetate, but it is talked about in other decrees extensively, especially on the church in the modern world. And so there is a lot said, and so there is this kind of people are available to grace, but there is a big discourse on secularism, and it's not particularly positive. And so there's a lot of work, I think, in future thinking there as well.
All right, two more questions. Here and here.
My question
Please,
is,
again, you stand again so that everybody can hear you, even if you...
okay. I'm a professor from somewhere else, so I know how to talk in front of people loudly. This is for Dr. Haight. It seems to me that you were implying in having a singular creator that the religions that are not monotheistic don't fit in so well. I was converted to interreligious dialogue when I went to Nigeria. I've been in Nigeria from 1993 to 2003 off and on. And there's a religion there called Ifa, which comes across the Atlantic essentially. It has a whole lot of God. And one point I think God, I think can speak a lot of different languages, not just Latin, English, Aramaic, and so on and so on. I think that there are other languages that you speak in which using the language involved many gods might work for people. And I thought, how come that the God that I worship wouldn't have left people for most of the world, and certainly in the continent of Africa, until the Christian Missionary Society arrived and started doing things that converted them to Christianity. So I said, that's not, conversion with the God that I believe in. So what do you think about that?
One more question to get on the table, please.
I wanted to ask about this group which is increasing all the time around the world, especially in this country, the so-called spiritual but not religious, the SBNR. So blurring the boundaries between religions, between traditions. And this is not a small group. It's in the tens of millions now. It's available all over the world. They are neither followers of any particular tradition, nor are they secular or certainly not atheists. They consider themselves spiritual, maybe more genuinely spiritual than those who subscribe to organized religion.
Thank you.
So how would you respond?
One of the reasons for announcing that I was a Christian theologian is to say that I was speaking within the context of Christianity and trying to expand the notion of God in such a way that it would be open to and recognize God at work in other religions. So tap into the logic of this distinction that Jerusha Lamptey uses between things that people share in common and particularities. A view of God in Christianity, I want it to be such that it would precisely respect and see as informative and something that you can learn from in recognizing the different conceptions of ultimate reality that come in the other traditions. But I am not fostering a surrender of monotheism and so on, but rather trying to understand a monotheism, that's our particularity, as this mono deity is understood through the preaching of Jesus and so on. That's our particularity, but I want it to be open and accommodating to others. Relative to spiritual and not religious, I just want to say that my view on that is that is not a negative development, but a positive development. And if you see it as a positive development and allow it to work as a principle, suddenly you can work with that. And it seems to me that no matter what tradition you're in, if the devotees of that religion, if the members of that religion or tradition are declaring themselves spiritual but not religious, then there's work to be done. There's work to be done, because I see these religious traditions, insofar as they take institutional forms, as precisely the protectors and the institutionalization of spirituality. So if people can be spiritual without religion, you'll want your religion to catch up with their spirituality.
I have to say, I worry about the people who are religious but not spiritual.
But on that point, yes. On this particular point, just to refer to one of the contributions to the book, Sally King, she took up this issue in her article, and while she affirmed, the value, the intent of searching for spirituality beyond religion, she also pointed out the dangers, and the dangers that I would want to affirm as well, is that in the stress of being spiritual without religious, I want to be spiritual but beyond Christianity and beyond Buddhism, beyond Hinduism, the danger is you're going to lose these wisdom traditions that have preserved the distinctiveness, distinctive contributions to the human search over all these centuries. So the danger of ending up with a spirituality that is no longer embodied, and we lose this profound and vast collection of wisdom traditions. I think that's a valid concern.
Just a brief comment on this. I think that spiritual but not religious, we also have to be really careful of reinscribing one of the main things that many people who identify as that are trying to not reinscribe, and that is that they are a collective entity, like spiritual but not religious, and Catholic and Muslim, because there's a lot of diversity in that, assuming of that label. And then the other thing that I would draw attention to is that I think, to Father Haight's point, spiritual but not religious is in somewhat a critique or resounding to crisis within institutionalized traditions that should be listened to. And I do think there are questions about how we carry forth tradition and embodied particularities if they do indeed have value. And I would also say that spiritual but not religious is asking us a question about how we tend to think about religious traditions as distinctive and isolated wholes. And I don't think that that's an accurate presentation of how most people do live their religiosity and spirituality or have lived it. And so this idea that we can identify someone as 100% Muslim and everything they do, and that, I just think that that's a myth. And so spiritual but not religious also calls us to contend with that myth.
All right, two more questions, they'll be the final ones. Yes.
Stephen Holton, as a way to put this together, Dr. Knitter, you spoke early about how Nostra Aetate was kind of a liberation, and previously spoken of being a prisoner. So as if our religious bodies are gilded, wonderful prisons, and suddenly we get out there and realize it's a wonderful world. And put that with the spiritual but not religious is a way forward to think of us as entering into an age of a spiritual gift exchange, if you will. Spiritual gift giving, thus hanging on to our individualized beauty, but without thinking that's all there is. Is there room in Christianity and Islam for that, for spiritual gift giving?
And then one more question in here. If there's a question from a student at Union, we will use that as kind of the final question.
What was the question for you, Professor?
Oh, my question was simply following on yours in part. Does to receive imply practice?
I'm going to start with that and then
Absolutely. There's so much here to be said, but just a few aphorisms, almost. First, I try to teach my students that our traditions we've not long had religions. So the very fact that our traditions were configured as religions and came to think of themselves to some extent as religions is already relatively, in terms of historical scope, a modern feature, including the notion that came with that is the sense of boundedness, non-porosity, and singularity, that you can only be one tradition, one religion at a time, whereas most human communities are sites of flow. In any actual community, traditions flow into and through them, including practice. In fact, for a variety of traditions, what matters most is practice. So part of what has happened when our traditions became religions is that they began to mirror a certain kind of prototypical religion, which is modern Protestant religion, which is highly creedal in focus. So when traditions become religions, they become to more or less extent creedalized, scripturalized. You have to get yourself a proper scripture to count as a religion. And you have to have certain ways of reading those scriptures, often mirroring the worst and distorted forms of literalized Protestant reading. So this is to say that what has happened when our traditions became religions is a focus on interpretive schemes and not the therapeutic regimes of particular traditions, from which those interpretive schemes need to be seen. What a tradition says about the world can only be seen by the body when the body practices. So yes, in this work of spiritual gift exchange, among the things we need to do most is learn to see how others see by practicing as they practice.
wow, two questions answered in one response.
I love the image of spiritual gift exchange. I think it's a beautiful image for our what we're intending by interreligious dialogue. And it reminds me of Christer Stendhal, Bishop Christer Stendel's comment about he wishes all religious people would have holy envy of the benefits they see in other traditions. Oh, I wish I had that. So I think it's beautiful. But John, your comment was exactly what I wanted to say. Still about spiritual, but not religious. It is to be spiritual. When someone would come to me and say, I'm spiritual but not religious, my question is, what's your practice? If you're spiritual, you have a practice. What is it? And I mean, I don't care what it is, and I think for many people more and more, that practice will be multi-religious. For me, mine is Christian and Buddhist, in both those forms. But it has to be, if you're going to take spirituality seriously, it has to include practice, and once you get into practice, you're going to be drawing on one of those, religious wisdom traditions.
So just to kind of put this panel in context and history of Union Seminary, founded in 1836 by 9 Presbyterian ministers, who were probably rolling in their graves with the discussion that went on tonight, with favorable mentions of popes by a Muslim scholar, by 3 Catholics and 1 from the Anglican tradition. And so, first of all, just my pleasure in having such fabulous colleagues. But also to say, because here at Union sometimes the initial response is one of critique and the way in which our religious traditions fall so short. We've been discussing tonight a document, there's no questions, particularly at the vantage point of 53 years. This is a very modest document. And there have been numerous commentaries that refine and nuance it. But it's a great parable to say that this brief, highly contested document in Latin from 1965 has started conversations that are still going on all over the world. And that, it seems to me, is a note of hope. And I always think it's good in this time to end things on a note of hope. So thank you.
I'm just glad the book, hopefully copies are present. You probably can coerce Paul to sign at $25.
It's a bargain.
On Amazon, it's like $35 or so.